The Prevention of Literature by George Orwell. George Orwell is the pen name of Eric Arthur Blair, who was an English novelist, essayist, journalist, critic, and pamphleteer. But later on in life, Orwell saw himself mainly as a political writer and a democratic socialist without any party affiliations or labels. But he was against totalitarianism and became more and more disillusioned with the methods of communism. The features of Orwell's writings. Orwell's writings are characterized by a plain, lucid, and colloquial style. They reflect his deep awareness of social injustice and opposition to totalitarianism. There is also an open support of democratic socialism in his writings. The essay The Prevention of Literature, first published in the British magazine Polemic in January 1946, contains Orwell's views on censorship and deals with the freedom of literature in the context of communism. In fact, it is concerned with the freedom of thought and expression, particularly in the context where the prevalent attitude in left-wing intellectual circles was in favor of the communism of the Soviet Union. The thoughts expressed in this essay might have been very well developed to a much longer dystopian novel, 1984, 3 years later. The meeting of the PEN Club to commemorate the tercentenary of Areopagitica, a pamphlet by John Milton in defense of the freedom of press, was the incident that occasioned the composition of this essay. The pamphlet contains Milton's famous phrase about the sin of killing a book. As good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God as it were in the eye. There were 4 speakers on the platform. The first speaker delivered a speech which did deal with the freedom of the press, but in relation to India. The second speaker said that liberty was a good thing, but in a very general way. The third speaker spoke against the laws relating to obscenity in literature. The fourth speaker devoted most of his speech to a defense of the Russian purges. Moral liberty seemed to be generally approved, but political liberty was not mentioned anywhere in the meeting. Not a single speaker could point out that the freedom of press signified the freedom to criticize and oppose. No mention was made of the various books which have been killed in England and the United States during the war. In effect, the meeting of the PEN Club turned out to be a demonstration in favor of censorship. The idea of intellectual liberty is under attack from 2 directions or 2 types of enemies. 1. Theoretical enemies or the apologists of totalitarianism. 2nd, practical enemies or the immediate enemies that include monopoly and bureaucracy. Thus, intellectual liberty in England is under attack from 3 sources: totalitarians, monopolies, primarily radio and film, and bureaucracies. There are a lot of things that work against writers and journalists. The concentration of the press in the hands of a few rich people, the monopoly on radio and films, the unwillingness of the public to spend money on books, the interference of official bodies like the Ministry of Information and the British Council, and finally, the continuous war atmosphere of the past 10 years. In a totalitarian society, a writer or any artist for that matter becomes a minor official, never daring to say the whole of truth. He gets absolutely no help from his own side, and there is no large body of opinion to assure him that he is in the right. The ideas of rebellion and intellectual integrity are all mixed up. Orwell says that it is ideologically criminal as well as practically dangerous to dare to stand alone. Now, this phrase is from a song written in 1876 by a Chicago Sunday school teacher named Philip Paul Bliss. The song was written to teach his students the book of Daniel. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone means that Daniel was daring enough to stand alone because he always believed that God was in control. But Orwell says that in a totalitarian setup, one has to deal with the more dangerous proposition that freedom is undesirable and that intellectual honesty is a form of antisocial selfishness. Straightforward reportage is in fact the only branch of literature that matters. The enemies of intellectual liberty always try to present their case as a plea for discipline versus individualism. The Catholic and the Communist cannot accept that an opponent can be both honest and intelligent. Now, therefore, the freedom of the intellect, which is actually the freedom to report what one has seen, one has heard, one has felt, and not imagined, must be defended against communists and their supporters. The fog of lies and misinformation regarding subjects like the Ukraine famine, the Spanish Civil War, Russian policy in Poland, and so on, is not due to conscious dishonesty entirely, but any writer or journalist who is fully sympathetic to the USSR is forced to acquiesce in deliberate falsification on important issues. In the essay, The Prevention of Literature, George Orwell mentions a very rare pamphlet written by Maxim Litvinov. This was written in the year 1918. The pamphlet, which outlines the recent events in the Russian Revolution, strangely makes no mention of Stalin, but gives high praise to Trotsky and also to Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others. The attitude of even the most intellectually scrupulous communists towards such a pamphlet was that it was an undesirable document that needed to be suppressed, just because it makes no mention of Stalin, and also because Trotskyism, a major school of Marxist thought based on Trotsky's ideas, opposed the theories of Stalinism. As a result, Trotsky was entirely written out of the history books under Stalin's rule. The effects of totalitarianism. A totalitarian state is in fact a theocracy, and its ruling caste, in order to maintain its power and position, has to be thought of as infallible. Now, therefore, it becomes frequently necessary to even rearrange the past events in order to show that certain mistakes were not made, or sometimes that some imaginary triumph has actually happened. Now, every major change in policy requires a corresponding change of doctrine and a pushing of some historical figure into prominence. Totalitarianism, in the long run, probably even demands a disbelief in the very existence of objective truth. It would probably set up a schizophrenic system of thought in which even the laws of common sense could be disregarded by the politician, the historian, and the sociologist. Totalitarianism thus exerts its greatest pressure on the intellect. In England, the immediate enemies of truthfulness and therefore of the freedom of thought are the press lords, the film magnates, and the bureaucrats. But more than this, it is the weakening of the very desire for liberty among the intellectuals themselves that constitutes the most serious issue of all. Literature is actually an attempt to influence the viewpoint of others by recording your experience. But Orwell says that in actuality, there is no such thing as a genuinely non-political literature. There is not much difference between a mere journalist and the most unpolitical, imaginative writer. The journalist is unfree as he is forced to publish falsehood or sometimes suppress important news. The same way, the imaginative writer is also unfree as he has to falsify his subjective feelings. He cannot solve the problem by keeping away from controversial topics. Prose literature has reached its highest levels in periods of democracy and free speculation. It is true that even under despotic regimes, literature has flourished. But the despotisms of the past were not totalitarian. The atmosphere of totalitarianism is deadly to the prose writers, but not so harsh to a lyric poet. Now let us examine the reasons why it is so. Firstly, the doctrines of totalitarianism are not only unchallengeable, but then they are also unstable. The attitudes of communists always keep changing. For example, their attitude regarding the war between Britain and Germany, their attitude towards Nazism, and so on. Secondly, Orwell says that it is easy for the politician to make such changes, but for a writer, if he is to switch his allegiance at exactly the right moment, he must either tell lies about his subjective feelings or else suppress them altogether. Political writing is the unavoidable result of self-censorship. To write in plain, vigorous language, one should be able to think fearlessly. But in the Middle Ages, there was absolutely no imaginative prose literature and very little in the way of historical writing for the same reason. It was impossible to think fearlessly. A society actually becomes totalitarian when its structure becomes flagrantly artificial. That is, when its ruling class has lost its function but succeeds in still clinging on to power either by force or by fraud. So such a society, no matter how long it persists, can never afford to become either tolerant or intellectually stable. It can never it can never permit either the truthful recording of facts or the emotional sincerity that a literary creation demands. Wherever there is an enforced orthodoxy, good writing stops. Now this was well illustrated by the Spanish Civil War. To many English intellectuals, The war was a deeply moving experience, but it was not an experience about which they could write sincerely or truthfully. As a result, the war produced almost nothing that was worth reading. The effects of totalitarianism upon verse was not as deadly as its effect on prose. It is somewhat easier for a poet than a prose writer to feel at home in an authoritarian society. These are the reasons. Bureaucrats and other practical men usually despise the poet too deeply to be much interested in what he is saying. Then, secondly, what the poet is saying, that is, what his poem means, if translated into prose, is relatively unimportant even to himself. Thirdly, the thought contained in a poem is always simple. A poem is nothing but an arrangement of sounds and associations, as a painting is an arrangement of brush marks. Orwell says that it is easy for a poet to keep away from dangerous subjects and also avoid uttering heresies. And even when he does utter them, they may escape notice. And then there are certain kinds of poems like the ballads, or on the other hand, very artificial verse forms that can be composed cooperatively or collectively by groups of people. These works are non-individual in the sense that they constantly change in passing from mouth to mouth, and they don't really have an identifiable author. Here is a list of the kind of reading matter that would survive in a rigidly totalitarian society. Newspapers. Newspapers will presumably continue until television technique reaches a higher level. This is what Orwell believed. Probably novels and stories will be completely superseded by film and radio productions. Then the low-grade sensational fiction. It would probably not be beyond human ingenuity to write books by machinery. The Disney films, for instance, the work is done partly mechanically and partly by teams of artists who have to subordinate their individual style. Radio features and also the innumerable books and pamphlets commissioned by government departments. Even more machine-like is the production of short stories, serials, and poems for very cheap magazines. Papers such as the Writer offering you ready-made plots and a sort of algebraic formula by the use of which you can construct plots for yourself. In short, imagination, even consciousness, so far as possible, would be eliminated from the very process of writing. In the meanwhile, totalitarianism has not fully triumphed anywhere. Our own society is still, broadly speaking, liberal. To exercise your right of free speech, you have to fight against the economic pressure and against strong sections of public opinion, but fortunately not against a secret police force. So that is why he says that our own society is still liberal. The direct and conscious attack on intellectual decency comes from the intellectuals themselves. This might be strange, But Orwell cites the reasons. Many scientists, for example, are the uncritical admirers of the USSR. For them, the destruction of liberty is of no importance as long as their own line of work is unaffected. Writers, on the other hand, are viciously persecuted. At least some of the English scientists do not see that any attack on intellectual liberty or on the concept of objective truth as threatening every department of thought in the long run. For the moment, totalitarian state tolerates the scientists because it needs them. The scientist has his function and can even be allowed a measure of liberty. His awakening will come later, when the totalitarian state is firmly established. Meanwhile, if he wants to safeguard the integrity of science, then it becomes his job to develop some kind of solidarity with his literary colleagues. If the liberty of thought perishes, that will be the end of literature. A bought mind is a spoiled mind. Imagination cannot flourish in captivity. Orwell argues that totalitarianism makes literature impossible. By literature, he means all kinds of writing in prose, from imaginative fiction to political journalism. He suggests that verse might slip through the cracks. He ends the essay on a note of uncertainty. His lament for the possible or the probable loss of imagination is itself an exercise in imagination. This is what makes this essay both a work of literature and also a political work. Thank you.